So first thing probably you need to know is which devices can be enrolled, which operating systems are supported. So let's run through a quick list. iOS version 14 and newer. iPadOS version 14 and newer. I tend to be a bit lazy about iOS and iPadOS, and so forgive me if I refer to just iOS, I mean both. macOS 11 and newer. Linux, Ubuntu Desktop 20.04 or newer. Android 8 and newer. Android Enterprise, and some Android open source project devices. Windows 10 and 11. Windows 10 and 11 on Windows 365. Windows 10 long-term servicing channel and Windows 10 Teams. Surface Hub. The first thing you'll need to do before you can start enrolling devices into Intune is to prepare the Intune environment for that. So you'll start by configuring Azure AD company branding. Now you'll have done that probably already because you wanted to make sure that when users joined Azure AD, they knew what organization they were joining. But typically a Windows device is going to then go on to auto-enroll. So it's important to make sure that you've configured the branding so that that's supported as well. You'll want to configure Azure AD device settings so that users can join or register their devices. You'll also want to define enrollment restrictions in terms of what sort of operating systems are going to be supported by your organization. I mean, the Intune supports the ones we've been through, but it might be that you only want iOS and macOS and Windows, for example, so you might want to restrict the others. You also might want to restrict the number of devices that users have, and there are other factors that can be considered and configured. You might want to set up enrollment managers. Those are individuals who perform the enrollment on behalf of end users. You might want to define device categories so that users can select from amongst predefined types of device when they enroll their device, laptop, cell phone, whatever. The thing about categories, and I'll come on to this in a demo, I suppose, is that you've got a great deal of flexibility about what device categories you define, but I think it's open to misinterpretation by the user, so I'm not sure how useful it can ultimately be. You can define terms and conditions that users can use when they perform the enrollment. So they might see what it is that's acceptable use policy and what is not, or what it is that they're doing, and they can confirm or disallow depending on what they read into those terms and conditions. In the demonstration, I'm going to go through all of that with you. I'm going to show you configuring the Azure AD settings, the enrollment restrictions. I'll set up enrollment managers. I'll define device categories, configure terms and conditions, and set up Windows auto enrollment. In other words, get everything ready for performing enrollments. So if you're going to configure the Azure AD branding, you probably want to go to Azure AD Admin Center, or indeed Entra, whichever you prefer. I'm in the Azure AD Admin Center here, so selecting Azure Active Directory folder. And then if I scroll down, I can configure company branding, which we went through earlier session. But just to reiterate, we can specify here. I'm just going to choose the legacy branding experience, which I'll just wait for that to happen. And there we go. So I've got a particular set of branding settings for default. I can configure different values for different departments if I want to. So here I can choose a particular graphic for a background, which you'll see displayed on sign-in pages. You'll see the Contoso demo banner logo appear in Autopilot and various other locations. You can then specify username hints and sign-in page text. I'm just going to change this date here to say 2023. And then I can configure color settings and other little thumbnails. Once I've got all of that configured, I can select Save. It's probably worth you being aware of custom domain names. At the moment, I'm using the default tenant that's assigned as a Microsoft 365 subscriber, which is a .onmicrosoft.com suffix. I can configure, when I take out my subscription, the bit that appears immediately before that. This is a demo tenant, so that's assigned for me as well in a sort of sequential way. But suppose my company was called Contoso, I might choose contoso.onmicrosoft.com as my default tenant, Microsoft 365 tenant name. However, I would want typically to assign an additional domain name, and it's pretty important you do that before you perform any Azure AD join operations or register operations, or indeed Intune enrollment settings, because users will see that. They'll be able to use their user account details to perform the join enroll activity, and this is a little bit cumbersome. So it's one of the things that as an administrator you need to take care of very early on in the process. You can do that here, or you can do that in the Office console, the Office Admin Center if you want to, whichever you prefer. Or I should say the Microsoft 365 Admin Center now. Okay, so I've configured the company branding. The next thing to do is to configure device settings in Azure Active Directory. And if I go to devices and then choose device settings, users need to be able to join devices to Azure AD or possibly register their devices depending on what it is you want to do. Register is typically for Windows devices that are owned by the user. This is a sensitive activity. I normally enable multi-factor authentication, as I know that I've mentioned in earlier sessions. So there's nothing for me to configure here. I'm just reviewing the settings. So that's all fine. The next thing I need to do is to configure the device settings over in the Intune Admin Center. For Windows, I can configure auto enrollment. It's automatic. There are two elements here. There's MDM user scope, which is the thing we need to configure so that the devices can be enrolled. And later on, when we talk about applications, we'll be talking about the mobile application management user scope. I've already turned that on, but that's also necessary for when you want users to be able to have their applications deployed and managed by Intune. So as long as that setting is configured, we're good to go. Okay, let's go back to devices now and let's review some of the other enrollment related settings. So if I go to enroll devices, we've looked at Windows enrollment, and I know in an earlier session when we looked at autopilot, we talked about the enrollment status page. That's something you'll probably want to configure. We can also configure enrollment notifications to send an email or push notifications to devices after they've been enrolled. So those are things that are certainly worth reviewing. And I've already been through autopilot, so I don't intend to go through any more of that now. But based on the fact that you've configured Azure AD join as possible and then auto enrollment, anybody that goes through the autopilot process, their device will also be enrolled. For Apple enrollment, there's a couple of extra steps that you might want to have to go through. The Apple MDM push certificate is necessary for your devices. You obtain the certificate from Apple, but to do that, you need to go through a wizard-driven system. So you'll acknowledge the licensing agreement here straight away. I've done this already. And then you will follow these numbered steps in sequence. You'll download a certificate signing request from Intune. You'll notice the certificate signing request file has a .csr extension. That's important to remember for the exam because it identifies that you've been through this process. You know what you've done. You've done this in the past. You understand the process. So it's a CSR file. It's the certificate signing request. You obtain that from Microsoft Intune. You then create your MDM push certificate. This opens up another page that navigates you through to Apple, where you sign in. You'll receive a notification on your Apple devices. This is an Apple thing rather than a Microsoft thing. So I'm allowing that, and I'm going to enter the code that was generated on my phone because I'm signing into Apple using my account. It's done that. And then from here, I can create a certificate. I acknowledge the license agreement here. I've not actually read it, but I suppose we go and read it now, and then accept. And then I choose my certificate signing request file from the downloads folder. I can track it down. There we go. There it is. And I upload that file. So that's the Intune file I upload to Apple. I can now download a certificate for mobile device management from Apple. That is configured as a PEM file. Again, something to remember for the exam. I don't need to open it or anything. I just need to know that it's there. So that's the certificate that's been downloaded, MDM_Microsoft Corporation _certificate.pem. Then I return to the Intune console and I enter my Apple ID again here. And then I select the certificate that I just downloaded, open it, and then finally I click Upload to complete the process. And that will then upload my certificates. I'm not going to do that because I've got some devices out that have an earlier certificate installed, so it's going to cause me a bit of a problem, but I'll leave that as is. But that's the step, and it's very guided. It's not terribly difficult to get wrong, but you will need an Apple account to complete that process. Android enrollment doesn't require a certificate, but you can configure enrollment notifications as you can for Windows. And then we get into the enrollment device limits and platform restrictions. So if you want to specify which types of device and how many devices users can enroll, you can configure a limit restriction and a platform restriction. In an earlier version of Intune, that used to be combined on the same page, but here it's separated. You'll notice that you can configure different limits for different groups. So you can create multiple limit restriction policies and platform restriction policies, and then assign them to different groups. At the moment, I've got one called default, which is assigned to all users and all devices, but I've also got one with a higher priority, although it has a lower numerical value. Lowest number wins. Number 1 is gold, number 2 is silver. If you think about it like that, then the lower number always wins. has a higher, more intrusive restriction. It limits sales users only to 5 devices, and I've assigned that one there. So to create a new number restriction, just quickly call it demo, I can specify the number between 1 and 15. So I'll choose 8. I won't worry about scope tags for now. I mean, I'll briefly talk about it. It's possible if you use tenant administration to create scope tags or tags. They're just text labels. So you might create a tag called city, and then you might create a value for city of London and New York and Sydney and so on. And then you can use scope tags that you've configured to be more specific about the assignment of something. So you can assign to a group sales, but if you wanted it only to be sales computers in London, then you would use the scope tag that you might have set up called city is London. Okay, I said I'll talk about it later. I've just talked about it. So that's covered. You'll find scope tags appears quite a lot actually in Intune. So it's not a specific thing to device enrollment. It's a thing to do with lots of factors in Intune. So it's worth going through the process of configuring scope tags and then using them as a way of being more specific about how something might apply. In this case, a device limit restriction. Then you go on to assign in the usual way by selecting a particular group, and then you review and create. I'm not going to go any further. It's not uncommon to set something up and then not assign it and then come back later and assign it. To configure an enrollment device restriction for platform, again, you come here and you select the tab for Windows, macOS, iOS, Android, and then you create a new restriction. And where there are multiple restrictions, you can set different priority values. And again, you can change the priority with the default restrictions are lowest priority. So any other restrictions that you create have a higher priority, although they have a lower numerical value. So I can create a restriction for Windows, for example, and then specify the platform range. So it might be 10.0.2, 10.0.2. So I'm saying basically Windows 11 is allowed. That would block effectively Windows 10 because that's 10.0.1. I can scope it again with tags if I want to, or just assign it, or both, depending on what I want to do. If I don't want standard users to perform the enrollment, or I want specific users to perform the enrollment on their behalf, I can configure device enrollment managers. All I need to do is to add the user account by specifying their email address, and they will then be able to enroll up to 1,000 devices if that's something that's important. It's not a bad idea, really, because not every user is going to necessarily need to know how to, or indeed know how to, enroll their devices. Okay, so that's some of the settings. If I scroll a bit further down under the devices node, there are some others that are related to enrollment. We've got device categories, for example. And you can set up device categories, and when a user enrolls their device, they will be prompted to select a category. So the typical enrollment process might include a user signing into a connected app and then selecting the option to let the organization manage their device, or they might install the company portal app, and then when they run that for the first time and sign in to that app, it will prompt them to select the category. As I said earlier, it can be useful for reporting purposes. When you want to do device inventory, you can filter based on device category, but bear in mind, not if you're as specific as I've been here, a user may not know the difference between a Surface Go, a Surface laptop, and a Surface Pro, or indeed a generic laptop. And so you need to be reasonably cautious about being over descriptive, I think. Otherwise, it can tend to be inaccurate. But anyway, that's what that does. Under tenant administration, there are also a couple of settings that are worth taking a look at. If I scroll down, I've got the terms and conditions that I can specify that users will see when they perform the enrollment of their devices. So sometimes when they perform a connection to a connected app, so if they configure their Teams client but choose not to enroll and connect to the Teams environment, they'll quite often see the terms and conditions of use. So you can configure different terms and conditions to different groups within your organization. So when a user signs in from the sales department, they may get different terms and conditions than a user that's signing in from the research department, for example. And it's all wizard driven, so it's not complicated to set up. So call that test, and then define the terms and conditions, and then say these are those. My typing's let me down again. Summary, and then you go on to assign it in the usual way. I don't see any point getting any further than that. Okay, so that's pretty much it from the sort of enrollment side of things. If I scroll back up here and take a look at devices, I can see the devices that are enrolled on the enrollment status page, and I can have a look at any enrollment alerts here as well. So I get a good idea about what's going on. Since this is a trial tenant, there's not a lot of activity and nothing normally goes wrong, at least not intentionally. In the demonstration, you learned how to configure Azure AD settings, enrollment restrictions, enrollment managers, device categories, terms and conditions, and Windows enrollment settings.